At the start of World War II, we see the Germans punch through the Ardennes forest and introduce a new kind of warfare to the world: Blitzkrieg. This was a fast, mechanized combined arms war with tanks, armored vehicles, and planes working in conjunction to overwhelm and outflank enemies. And of course, we all know that at Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied forces were stuck there. While they were all rescued, one thing comes to mind. Why didn't the Allies do more during the so-called Phony War to prepare for German onslaught? The idea of this lull in fighting at the beginning of the war was thought of both by France and Britain at the time. They both still had the Great War still in their mind, and of course for good reason. But this made them think of this war with Germany in a long-term conflict that came with several different stages. The idea of a longer war was part of the plan for the countries to slowly mobilize their superior army and resources that would affect the war over time, along with another blockade of the Germans to help boil them down through an economic standpoint as well. But the overall strategy remained vague, and during the duration of the Phony War, they thought they had found a war-winning formula. Of course, today we see the initial strategy as a military disaster, as we have the great comfort of foresight. Their strategy of being on the defensive gave the initiative to Germany and put in place a Maginot mentality, which is a fatal mix of complacency and overconfidence that really helped to push them to be inactive. Though when looking at it through the eyes of time, we see that the First World War took nearly 6 years of most of the world to defeat Germany the first time around. So knowing this, they knew that the next war would be another long and tough one indeed. When looking at World War II, we of course see that the Allies did absolutely nothing to stop themselves from being overrun by Germany and later incurring defeat by letting France fall. But of course, this is false, and while in our own history the Allies did get overrun and lose the battle for France, this falsehood of the idea that the Allies did absolutely nothing is simply untrue. While the Phony War was going on, the Allies did many things to prepare themselves for the upcoming war. When looking at the French and the British, we often see that their Maginot mentality is how they conceived and wanted to wage war between that fateful September of 1939 all the way up to May of 1940. They did such things as ramp up their armament production, and this is them producing more weapons such as tanks, planes, and especially ammo for things such as artillery. During the First World War, all global powers found themselves short of artillery shells from the very beginning of the war. So while seemingly sitting around and waiting for the Germans to attack, they were actually getting their war machine running for a long and drawn out war. Not only did they prepare their war machine, the French especially decided that the Germans would be incredibly strong as the war went on. They then decided to go on the offensive, for if they could not win in a long protracted war, they would have to beat the Germans in a quick, decisive way. The French wanted to seize the military initiative, not only on the western front with the Germans, but with other such theaters like the Balkans and Scandinavia, and where the French led, the British followed. The French had mobilized millions of soldiers and were ready to meet the Germans in the fields of Belgium. The French had also had their own tanks, and quite a few, and they were even considered to be better armored and armed than the German ones at the time. What of course was lacked was the use of the tanks in the French army. The French used them with infantry as support, while the Germans used them as their tank in its own individual unit, as a spearhead for attacks. And showing that the Allies did not sit idly while the Germans prepared for war, we will look into one of the biggest plans led by the French, which was an expedition into the Balkans. Now, if the Allies could not win a long war, they would of course have to win a quick and decisive one, and the French believed that a campaign throughout the Balkans would help achieve this. They believed that a small but powerfully equipped and mobile Allied military force would knit together the Balkan armies into a powerful force which would number over 100 divisions. This was supported mostly by General Maxime Weygand. Of course, like I said before, where the French led, the British did follow. But the French were especially interested in this Balkan expedition, and so were the British as well. But at first, the British presented a solid front of opposition to their ally, and behind the scenes, an even greater amount of uncertainty could be detected, especially in their military circles. But because of other events, this was of course put on hold and not able to get any real fruition. Before any more plans could be made about an expedition into the Balkans, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Soviet Winter War. This caused the French and British to try to focus in the Scandinavian area to try to resupply the Finnish with any kind of supplies they could. This of course put a big pause in many of the plans that might have been completed, like the Balkan campaign. And without these delays, it could have been vital for the Allies to actually seriously consider sending a force to the Balkans, which would have opened up a front against the Germans, which also wouldn't have allowed the Germans to concentrate all other forces against the French. The British and French were also very afraid that the Soviets and Germans were going to start working together even more than they already had. At this time, they already had a non-aggression pact that helped them split Poland in two when it was invaded. And the Allies were mostly worried about their naval blockade of Germany, which would become utterly useless by the fact that the Soviets could absolutely supply the Germans with what they needed to continue the war. The Allies thought so much of the possibility of a Soviet and German pact that there was a plan put in place to try to cripple the military machine of the Soviet Union. This plan was for the Allies to bomb the Caucasus oil fields, which would paralyze the Soviet military machine and disorganize Soviet national life, but also cause acute embarrassment to the Germany by eliminating all hopes of Soviet material assistance. And there was a man named McLean who insisted that the Allies had to act quickly to prevent the establishment of a Soviet-German partnership, and to win the war, the Allies must knock out the Soviet Union first. Though a war with the Soviet Union and the Germans might have actually pushed them even closer together, a man named Halifax hugely opposed the Baku project on the grounds that if it would alienate not only labor leaders at home, but it would open the British to Soviet retaliation in the Middle East and against India. But there were still many who were doubtful that a peaceful resolution with the Soviet Union could be found. And to try to help his own case, Halifax was forced to resort to a desperate measure. And in March, he agreed to the idea of sending Stanford Cripps, a prominent labor leader, to Moscow to sound out the Soviets on a possible rapprochement. When the mission failed to produce any concrete results, Halifax seized upon a suggestion by the Soviet ambassador for a commercial agreement. And although managing to overcome a lot of the officials that wanted to go to war with the Soviet Union, he had effectively become hostage to Moscow's response. And when, as expected, the Soviets rejected any obligation to stop their economic relations with Germany, the case for some military action emerged stronger than ever. France and Great Britain went to war in September of 1939 with a long war strategy, founded on the principle of that time that the balance of power would shift decisively in the Allies' favor in a long contracted war. Scholars who had concentrated on the Western Front during this time knew that the Allies voluntarily ceded to the initiative to Germany, and they assumed that the French and British remained wedded to this strategy of complacency. So, descriptions from this time period, from September of 1939 to May of 1940, as a phony war are thus confirmed. But an examination of military planning on other fronts, however, reveals a very different picture. Rather than passiveness and complacency that emerges from such an examination, is that the sense of crisis that overtook the French and British strategy during the course of that year. The result was that the abandonment of the long war strategy in favor of a short one. The crisis, of course, was most pronounced on the French side. Dissatisfied with the Allied strategy manifested itself in the opening months of the war, and the proposals for an Allied military expedition to the Balkans aimed at opening a second front in Germany's rear. The French, especially convincing themselves that the Allies could not win a long war, had desperately sought to win a short one, and of course they lacked the obvious means to. But this bred desperation, which was evident in the increasing recklessness of their planning. Such recklessness as in military action in Scandinavia to gain control of the Swedish iron mines, ignoring the signs that an economic war was a slow-working weapon. But the French planners argued that by cutting off the supplies of Swedish iron ore, the Allies could quickly defeat Germany and bring it to its knees. Evermore, the British plan of Baku, which they had convinced themselves that by destroying the Soviet oil industry could inflict a decisive blow on both the Soviet Union and Germany, not thinking of the dire situation they would be in, fighting two of the strongest nations not only in Europe but in the world. The British on that end were much more relaxed, seeing as they were separated from the continent. British planners often appeared hesitant and cautious, but nevertheless, during 1939 to 1940, the British had also come to doubt the wisdom of a long war strategy. And though British leaders were successful to resist the French proposals for a Balkan expedition in the opening months of the war, to continue their resistance though, Chamberlain and Halifax remained extremely reluctant to seize military initiative. But in the end, they were being forced to give way before the growing consensus in support of intervention. In the end, the plans for both parties, the French and British, made the most sense. The French wanted to see a short war as they bordered Germany, and just not long ago, their land was embroiled in a fierce battle with the Germans. And the British, being apart from the continent with their own island and a powerful navy, had more of a wait-and-see approach. And the downfalls were the French's ridiculous and overeager amount of willingness to go on military expeditions that the French and British just could not afford to commit to, along with the British that made them lose sight of the strategic reality during the Phony War.